Just in terms of an overall observation, I suppose one of the things that I find most interesting and most striking about many parts of the world is really the very profound change in definitions and meanings attached to adulthood. And I think that, well, certainly for the first time in modern societies, adulthood has ceased to necessarily contain a component whereby it's required or expected that adult responsibility carries with it responsibility for the next generation. So we can now have a definition of adulthood which is free from the responsibility of the new generation. And of course, many, many more people in many parts of the world, particularly advanced economies, are now living life that way. They now live a very protracted period of time where they have very, very little to do with new generations. They don't directly because they don't have children themselves, but also are doing things in their lives, doing jobs and living their lives in such a way where they're really insulated from that interaction. And I think that really is quite novel historically, to have that kind of level of generational fracture. And I think it poses a lot of very important and troubling issues about how that then works out. You know, if you think about horizon scanning and how this develops going forward, where do you kind of end up? And I think it works out very differently in different cultures. But say you look at Japan and other, you know, cultures and countries in that part of the world. I mean, the situation now is really quite profound and astonishing, isn't it? The extent to which a large sector of society is really having nothing to do with children. And what I wanted to raise, I suppose, as one issue for discussion coming out of that, you made the point that, you know, there's all sorts of things that you could think about the backdrop to all of this, what the drivers for it is, why it's happened, you know, the relative balance of economic factors, cultural factors, you know, what it is that's making this change happen. One of the things that I think is interesting, following on your point about the separation of marriage and sex, we then have the separation of sex and reproduction. So at a point, broadly speaking, around the 60s onwards, sex and sexuality becomes a phenomenon in itself. I think it's interesting to think about for looking at how perceptions and understanding shift generationally, what sex, and particularly heterosex, starts to mean for people. And again, I think Japan is interesting in this way because you now have an extremely extensive subculture of essentially celibacy, whereby relations between men and women have become so perceived to be so complicated, difficult, testing, that younger people are just opting out altogether and they're just not doing it. You know, they're not having sex, they're just living life in a completely different way. And that is really profound once you have a kind of breakdown. And I would say in terms of cultural aspects of this, one of the things I find quite interesting, comparing the sort of narratives and conceptualizations of sex that emerged out of the 1960s, when you have this fissure emerging between reproduction and sex. The idea of sex, therefore, as being something which is fun, liberating, that you want to do as much as possible without the dangers that go along with unwanted pregnancy. You know, and you've got contraceptive control, you've got legal abortion. This can become a pleasurable part of life. The extent to which heterosex has now become imbued with risk, danger, difficulty, you know, the whole, broadly speaking, emergence of sex as having to be safe. But also, if you look at the words that now go along with sex, sex comes with harassment, sex comes with abuse. There's very little I can see where there is a positive narrative of heterosex. And I think that is really, really difficult. You know, where does that go? Because if you know, I mean, never mind not getting married. if new generations opt out, if men and women opt out of having very much to do with each other, because it all comes with danger warnings, and we have to have consent classes, and we have to ask permission for everything all the time, and we now retreat. You know, and it's interesting looking, it was one of, I've seen Jonathan's slides already, and I wonder what Jonathan thinks about this, the kind of, the drop-off in teenage conception rates in Britain. If you look at the data that's come out of NATSAL, it's one of the big surveys about sexual activity in Britain, people over 50 are now having more regular sex than people aged 16 to 24. Now that's very nice for the over 50, but what is happening, right? And it's one of, I mean, I would say that's as much to do with the teenage pregnancy strategy in terms of an explanation for the falling incidence of teenage pregnancy, just they're not having any sex. So they're not getting, you know, and that's, you know, that takes things on to a new level, doesn't it? And I think that's very interesting when you, and important when you think about the future. How do boys and girls get on with each other now? You know, and you can call that well-being if you want. I mean, I think it is a psychological burden